Before I introduce our next speaker is kind of give a little perspective to those watching us on the internet where exactly we are, where we're located. We're in Livermore, California. Livermore is located 45 miles east of San Francisco. We are south of Napa and again east of San Francisco. And what really makes this a unique growing area is we're in a valley, Livermore Valley, and we're oriented in an east-west configuration, and that really helps us take advantage of the maritime influence which comes through the Golden Gate Bridge at night. We'll have, as Tyler can attest to last night, it can be 90, 100 degrees here during the day, and we'll have a 30, 40 degree drop at night. We get that nice big blue influence coming through the Golden Gate into the Livermore Valley, and it'll drop down into the 60s. So the grapes like that, warm days, cool nights, and then it's our rocky soil here what really makes us unique. We have over 600 feet of bedrock and a very nice even distribution of peat gravel to that bedrock. So we're in Livermore, California, 45 miles east of San Francisco, south of Napa. I wanted to introduce next our next speaker. He's a winemaker for Winesmith and Cheapskate Wines. He is the co-owner of Vinovation Incorporated, a consulting firm, and he taught wine chemistry for over 20 years. He's the leading authority on the enhancement of wine structure and use of reverse osmosis to optimize wine grape maturity, and it's my pleasure to welcome great crafter Clark Smith.
Thanks, John. Most of you are familiar with my work as a wine technologist, and I guess I ought to sort of announce that I got out of that business in 2008, kind of at the behest of Roger Dial, who asked me to come in and I sort of changed my day job from being a wine technologist to being a wine writer, and I now run the Best of Appellation program at Appellation America and do a column for Wines and Vines. Basically, I thought at one time that the primary challenge in the industry was technical, and so I worked for 15 years on developing new means to make wines better, and I think I've kind of closed that chapter, and now I see much more clearly that the problem really is distribution. You know, there's an awful lot of really good wine out there, and it's not I'm afraid as Americans we have a Super Bowl mentality where we just want to know what the best one is, and the trouble is they're all pretty good these days, and we're trying to put a very large amount of wine through a very small pipeline. So I'm going to address that problem here, and I called it Picking Winners, a survival guide for wine growers. So to put it into perspective, and I'm looking at it from my personal perspective of being a retailer in the East Bay in the mid-70s. So at that time, there were 200 wineries in the U.S., and today there are about 6,000. So that gives you some idea of what we're up against, more than 100-fold increase in the number of wineries. I'd like to say that we have the same distribution system we had then, but I'm afraid even that isn't the case. In 1975 we had 3,500 distributors in the United States, and now we have 700. So it's very similar to the situation in the music industry, where the AM dial hasn't gotten any bigger. We've got 2 million garage bands out there with absolutely no way to distribute, except the internet seems to work better as a pipeline for music than as a pipeline for wine. We just can't seem to get that spigot to work in the USB drive. Let's look at, in Petit Sirahs specifically, in 1975 there were 20 Petit Sirahs. Today there are 735. If you think all of those are going on the shelf at Safeway, you better think again. Wine styles have never been more diverse. This is not the chatter on the internet, but Alice Firing shouldn't be shopping at Safeway. There's a huge amount of diversity in wine. So, core problem number one, if you ask the consumer Chianti versus Beaujolais, they understand what you're talking about. If you ask Howell Mountain versus Russian River, not so much. We really have not established identities for our appellations in the minds of the consumer, and that's going to hurt us big time. Third-party endorsements have never been more important. Just at the time when we really need them, we have a scandal around wine competitions, around judge inconsistency. There's a guy named, he was professor of statistics at Humboldt State named Robert Hodgson, and this is a Wall Street Journal article, one of many I could have quoted, stating that the system is badly flawed, coin toss, and that the wine decisions that are made at competitions may be merely a powerful illusion. That's the kind of scuttlebutt that's out there right now. Hodgson published 2 studies, one at the California State Fair where he gave the same judge the same wine twice and found no statistical correlation between the answers the first time and the second time. And in the other paper he compared the results of 9 different fairs and showed that there was no pattern to the awarding of medals in the different fairs. So there's been a lot of conversation about the various reasons why this is true, and I think it is a complex topic, but in my opinion, the core problem is really quite simple, and that is we have a very broad diversity of products, as I just said, and we have absolutely no standards. I challenge you to name another product which is evaluated in competition without any standards whatsoever. And so that makes for lousy results. What were you, well, like, of course, because, it was fine in the early 80s when there were 100 Cabernets and half of them had H2S or VA or aldehydes. And so you just throw out all the crap and then take the ones that were sort of okay, give them bronzes, take the ones that were really pretty good, give them silvers, and the ones that really sent you and give them golds, and that's all there was to it. But now we have 90-95% of the wines being really pretty good, and at the top end we have tons of diversity. We have wines from the 50 states, and maybe we have 5,000 Cabernets now, and so we have no way of looking at the diversity. We just tell a judge, oh, just pick something that puts a smile on your face, and that might be different now than it is 15 minutes from now. Okay, now, if we were to take that approach in dog shows, they would murder us in our beds. This is the complete dog book from the American Kennel Club, and it has the written standards for 169 breeds. There are 7 categories, and I put it to you that a category is like a varietal. If you have 27 sporting dogs, you don't try to judge them by all the same standards. This I put up here as an example the official standard for the greyhound. And it's worth taking a little bit of a look at because although some things are quite metric, how do you make this thing work? How do we do it? Well, down at the bottom, you see the weight. A dog is a male, 65 to 70 pounds, and bitches 60 to 65. So that's pretty easy to measure. What, the red? Okay. But a lot of this other stuff is kind of subjective, and so you need a trained judge that really understands exactly what is meant by some of this language. Okay, so if that doesn't shame you, let me show you the standards for developed by the Brewers Association. There are 69 categories of beer, and these are the kind of standards that they write. And it seems to me we ought at least to do that. So, solution regional profiles within varietal categories. Pretty simple, and at least we should be telling the judges where the wines come from, so that we don't have just a grab bag of Petit Sirahs all in an unspecified group. Of those 6,000 wineries in America, can anybody here name the fastest growing winemaking state? Iowa. Iowa's a very good guess. It's number 2. And I'll mention about Iowa that there were 6 wineries in 2001. Now there's 120. There's over 1,000 wines from Iowa. And when we reviewed those wines, we looked at 84 Iowa wines and gave 35 of them best of appellation status. Those are really good wines. Virginia. 1,000 feet, limestone, maritime influence. Back to high school with that one. It's North Carolina. But next year it'll be somebody else. There's just thousands of fascinating stories happening out there. The Lake Erie wines are unbelievable wines. Of course, the Finger Lakes wines and the Long Island wines. A lot of good wines out there, and nobody's telling a story. When do you think Robert Parker's going to put out his reviews of Iowa wines? He's really fighting the last war, and I think most of the press is, but I do think in the next 10 years that varietal diversity in America is going to be the really interesting story. So that's what's going to happen. And here's some examples of stuff that's already come out about those. Right now, because of what Dan and I are doing, Petit Sirah is leading the pack on varietal diversity. These are a couple of articles that I wrote that you have in your handout there. Just a general article, and another one on the sources of Petit Sirah's regional diversity that you might find interesting. I will mention just one aspect of this, which is that I really believe that Petit Sirah not only is a uniquely well-suited varietal to the west coast of the United States, but also has it all over Syrah because of the Pellersan parent, which has a sort of a grapefruit, very floral aspect to it, which gives a real charm to Petit Sirah that Syrah really lacks. And when you look at large groups of Petit Sirahs and then you move on to the Syrahs, you really get pretty bored in comparison. So I really think we've got something where most of the wines are really quite good, and we'll see that in the afternoon. So we cooked up this idea of reforming judging by, number one, allowing the judges to know where the wines come from, and we did that generally. But in addition, and this is an article that will be out next week in Wines and Vines, and I went ahead and printed up my submission for you in your handouts. And the point I want to make here is that we did judge the Petit Sirahs and only the Petit Sirahs according to standards. How do we do that? Well, in the last year and a half, we were able to put together 28 of there are 80 AVAs that grow Petit Sirah, and we have standards for 28 of them. That was enough to do the majority of the wines. So I want you to focus on all of the benefits of changing judging in this way. The first, of course, is to improve fairness. Just as an example, a Howell Mountain Petit Sirah would not do very well in a random competition, but if you know it's from Howell Mountain, then the consumer's been warned that you're going to have remorseless tannin in there, and that's why you buy it. And so they get a better shake there. So we're trying to improve not only fairness but credibility in the judging. Secondly, to provide the same kind of style profiling to consumers that they already have in the wines of Europe. And they really have a leg up on us, because people know what Barolo is and they know what Muscadet is, but they have no idea what Dry Creek Petit Sirah is. So promoting appellation consciousness, and then as a way to get started in stimulating interest in American AVA diversity and hopefully spreading this whole idea into all the varieties that we grow. Okay, so here's a standard. I want to point out some specific things here. We're specifying the appearance, aroma, flavor, and balance, and we will often include what we think are production correlations. So the winemaking, for example, you would always expect a malolactic in a Napa, Chardonnay, generally whole berry cluster fermentations in Monterey and so forth. Those are examples of enological variables, viticultural, and then the natural terroir characteristics. It's possible to have more than one style profile. So in this case, we just have California Petit Sirah, and there's from the best of Appellation wines, we were able to find two different styles. One that was natural, organic, or biodynamic wines that had a very different flavor expectation than sort of the standard, what we call the generous style. In I guess the biggest extreme is Finger Lake Rieslings. We have 6 profiles, so there's always room to add one more if there are examples of wines that have quality and are showing off a different characteristic. Here's a few more standards. Let me see if we got the Russian River here. No, we don't. I will mention that Russian River is an example of where we need an extra standard, and in fact in Riverside the standard aromatic profile was present in a wine that we looked at, but most of the Russian River wines are in a fog belt, and so they don't have very good color. But this one happened to be way upriver, and it had exceedingly good color, so we needed an extra style profile, but we gave it a double gold anyway, and it went up to the sweepstakes and took the whole competition. So it gives you some idea of the flexibility and power of the technique. And in your handout, you have all 28 standards. My request to you, kind of the reason that I'm standing here talking to you, is we need 2 things from you. If your AVA is not one of those 28 profiles, I beg you to either work with Appellation America or on your own get your Wine Grower Association together and generate a profile so that we can use it in the judging. We'd like to hit 100%. Secondly, if your profile is there, you might want to read it and get in touch with us to see if there's anything that you want to amend, or maybe you want to add a profile. So, big job, huh? I think the work to date shows that it is not an impossible job. We're about 25% done with the whole country. We have 307 AVAs, but we do have over 200 regional profiles from 58 of those AVAs. The Appellation America Blue Book contains 28 of the 90 Petit Sirah producing AVAs, and that was enough to cover 76% of the wines that were submitted at Riverside and Long Beach. Again, wine grower associations are the best source of standards, and Best of Appellation panel is here to assist that process, should you desire it. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Okay. Rusty.
Dan and I have talked about competitions for years, and
do you want to get him a mic?
Test. Dan Berger and I have talked about competitions for years, and my argument with Dan always was, why should I enter a competition if the competition isn't going to help me promote the results? All I do is pay my money, send in my wines, costs a lot of money to enter competitions, and the competitions aren't helping me. So that was always my argument with Dan. We go back and forth. Well, I think we agree on the judging standards, but I'll go back to this. Sounds like a great system, but if consumers don't know about it, then you're not giving Riverside or Long Beach any more credibility.
Well, I think that's right. The next step is that we need to give the consumers access to the profiles when they see the gold medal. I mean, if I see a gold medal Chardonnay, I generally tend to run the other way. It doesn't necessarily mean that I would want actually to drink the wine. I need to know whether it's an oaky toasty butter bomb or a Merceau style or just what it is. And so the problem with style profiling specifically is that it doesn't relate to anything that's on the label. It's very important to just like with Chianti and Beaujolais, the consumer has to be able to associate something on the label with the style profile, and so that's the reason it's important to concentrate on AVAs and style expectations inside. And you're absolutely right. It's going to be a long road, but I think over the next 10 years we will make that progress because people are really interested. They're buying based on appellation, but they don't really know what it means yet.
Quick question. Is the information that is an appellation and Dan, is that open for us to share with our consumers?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. It's all on the Appellation America site.
But we can use that and say it came from Appellation.
Without question.
Okay, cool.
Hi, I have a quick question. How many wines from each appellation did you have as a minimum in order to develop the profile?
It's possible to develop a style profile with a single wine. I mean, obviously the answer varies quite a bit, but I'll give you an example. We have a best of appellation for a Petit Verdot out of Sassoon, and there's only one Petit Verdot vineyard in Sassoon, but we gave that wine our highest rating. It was the Gascony Cadets from Forlorn Hope, and that is one kick-ass wine, and that's really all we needed to convince us that the area had a great potential, and we just used that wine to write the profile, sort of the Chateau Grillet example, I suppose. But it is possible to take one good wine and define a style from it.
I'd like to hear your comments on prejudicing judges by letting them know the appellation ahead of time. Do you think the judgment of Paris would have worked out the same way if everybody knew where all the wines came from?
Of course not. That's a really good way of putting it. I'm always thinking about what Spencer Tracy says to the judge in Inherit the Wind when they decide that the testimony of scientists about Darwin's theories is not only irrelevant to the monkey trial but also illegal. And he looks at the judge and he says, "But Your Honor, how can they pass judgment if they don't know what it's all about?" I think we need to hold judges to a standard of professionalism, and they may take a while getting used to it, but it's certainly no more prejudicial than price categories.
Hello, Clark.
Hey, Ken.
Hey.
I thought you were dead.
Yeah. I'm a long way away here.
Did you sell your soul?
Yeah. Listen, I just wanted to point out that some of the best dogs in America are crossbreeds.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's really just whatever you put on the label. I mean, certainly the best Zinfandels have Petit Sirah in them.
Yeah, they're all doggone good, for sure.
Especially yours. Or your daughter's. Is your daughter too busy making wine?
All right, we'll take one more question and then we'll move on.
There you go.
Well, I wasn't really thinking of a question, kind of more along a comment. Well, maybe this would be the question. Whose palate is making that decision? I think the coolest thing about wine is that everybody who tries a wine has a different opinion about the same wine. So whose palate becomes the palate?
Yeah, well, you know, Appellation America is just trying to get the ball rolling here. I think the answer to the question was on that last slide. We're kind of following the lead of the American Kennel Club here that the local wine grower association should make the decisions, just like the Greyhound Club wrote that standard. And so it's up to the local wine growers to speak up if they don't like what's posted and make whatever adjustments that they want to, according to how they want to be known and what they want consumers to think about their wines. And in the meantime, I think that information can be sourced from anywhere. Just like you could take anybody that was halfway knowledgeable about wine and ask them what Chianti and Beaujolais are. I think we can get the ball rolling that way. Well, I think I've probably taken up more than enough time.
Oh, thank you, Clark. Yeah, actually, we do have one more question, and it comes from online. So let's go ahead and get that question.
Okay, the question...
Only 140 characters, please.
The question is, I'd love to see if Clark has a take on any Petit Sirah from Colorado, like Infinite Monkey Theorem, Arizona, like Freitas, Page Springs, Pillsbury, New Mexico, Texas, or Pennsylvania, Blue Mountain, or any other PS from states not bordering the Pacific.
Well, I don't want to make the other girls jealous, so I won't mention the specific, but you can get it online, and I will say that in the Long Beach competition, the wine that went up to sweepstakes was from New Mexico.
Wow. Thank you, Clark.
Thank you.
Okay. Our next presenter, he's been a wine columnist since 1976. He writes a weekly wine commentary called Dan Berger's Vintage Experiences. And his nationally syndicated wine column, he has a nationally syndicated wine column for Creators, a syndicate. He's a contributor and author of numerous books, including Beyond the Grapes, an inside look at the Napa Valley. I'd like to please welcome Dan Berger.
The topic is narrow. The answer is divergent and is incomplete. And unfortunately, we don't have a final word on this, because the final word is going to be coming in about a decade, maybe more. And that is how to identify the greatness in Petit Sirah and how it works through the competitions. If wine competitions are going to be seen as relevant as an alternative to scores, then Petit Sirah will ride the wave of Petit Sirah gold medals and silver medals at wine competitions. It's not going to be through somebody identifying, for example, picking up a bottle of wine and looking at the label and saying, oh, gee, that's Petit Sirah, that's probably about 85 points. Let's pull the cork and see. And this is what has happened for almost every variety in California, with the exception of a few. I go back to Frank Schoonmaker in approximately 1941, when we began to see the identification of wine as a varietal. Prior to that, everything was generic. About 98% of wine made in the United States back in the 1930s and up through 1940 was generic wine. Some of it was faux generic, such as Lou Fopiano's Sauterne, which came out of the same tank as his Chablis. You remember those days, Lou? Anyway, that's another story. So Frank Schoonmaker argued very vociferously for varietal wine, and we're entering a new theory coming up now. In fact, we start with the year 2010. We have a third wave, which I'll get to in a few minutes. But if these wine competitions are going to help Petit Sirah grow into a full-fledged variety, we have to get away from the question that was raised by Clark in one of his articles that you'll see in your packet, where Andre Simon and others talked about Petit Sirah as not a noble variety. Now, why was that decision made? Because California had not yet registered its opinion by putting out 750 Petit Sirahs that really do show that this is a noble variety. How can I say that without giving you an example? Was Malbec a standalone variety before Argentina arrived? Was Gruner Veltliner a standalone variety before Austria arrived? And I can go on and on and on. There are all kinds of examples. The classic single case example of Gamay Noir. Has Gamay Noir arrived? If you ever tasted Amity Vineyards in Oregon, their Gamay Noir, you'd know it's a noble variety. How do we know this? Because of characteristics that the wine shows in particular soils and in particular regions where a style has developed because the variety adapts to that area in which the consumer can then identify distinctiveness. When did you ever see distinctiveness being used by somebody who gave a score of 98 or 96? You don't see distinctiveness, you see sameness. In fact, it is the sameness that is at the heart of the scoring system. One of the reasons I have refused to use scores in all the years I've been writing about wine was that it will lead to sameness, and you don't want sameness, you want distinctiveness. If anything, Petit Sirah represents distinctiveness. What does it smell and taste like? It smells and tastes like two things at its best. Number one, it smells like Petit Sirah. And number two, it smells like its region. And if we put those two things together, we come to the answer the gentleman back here asked earlier about should we prejudice the judges, which I will answer in a few minutes. The parameters that are needed for any grape variety to be evaluated properly are at the heart of what Hodgson was investigating with his somewhat flawed analysis of wine competitions. In fact, I completely disbelieve what Hodgson wrote, except for one thing. His conclusion was right. His methodology was terrible, but his conclusion was correct. Results at wine competitions, by and large, are horrible. I can prove that by using as an example the Australian system. I've been a judge at 17 wine competitions in Australia over the years. And during that period of time, the system that they use, number one, is that every wine competition in Australia uses the same template for entering wines. If you don't have the same template, you have different standards. I will go through that in a moment with the answer to that question. When I sat down in 1993 at the Adelaide show to judge, the first thing that happened when we sat down to judge Syrah, Shiraz, if you want to call it that, or Syrah, according to some of those pronouncers down there, was that James Halliday sat there with the three senior judges. I was one, and there was another winemaker, and there was James Halliday, who is arguably the best taster in the world today. And he said, let us go through the regional characteristics of what Shiraz gives you so that you can then be attuned to the different regional styles that are all valid as gold medals in this competition. There is the blueberry style of the northern McLaren Vale, and there is the red cherry style of the southern McLaren Vale. We were splitting hairs here, but it was really valuable. There is the leathery style of the Hunter Valley. There is the herbal style of the Coonawarra. There is, and it went on, and I'm taking notes furiously on this because I hadn't heard this before in 1993. Well, what ended up happening was an unbelievable scenario where we go through the wines and you start to see these regional characteristics, and this was a very brief description by Halliday. Halliday, of course, knows it instinctively. It's in his bones. But for the newcomer, the first-time judge and a second-time judge in Australia to judge a Shiraz category and to see these different styles, it suddenly gave me a clue. The question was, should you tell judges at competitions all about the region that they're judging? If you go backwards, instead of giving them just parameters and saying this is the style you should find in this region, why don't you give them the region and see if they can find something that fits within the parameters of what you're trying to establish. We began to do this. actually starting in about 1992 at the Riverside wine competition, which I have coordinated for 29 consecutive years. When you coordinate a competition for 29 years, you have a chance to do a lot of experimentation. And in about 1992 or thereabouts, I established a rule, and Clark was a judge back then, and it worked fine for what it did. It allowed the wineries to enter their Chardonnays into one of three categories: a light, a medium, and a heavy. The wineries had the choice. If you made a butter bomb, it was really soft and rich and had lots of oak, put it in the heavy style category. If you had a wine that was delicate, put it in the light style category. End result was we had a breakdown of about 25% light, 25% heavy, and 50% medium body, which told me something about the way wine was being made in those days. We continued this practice for almost 10 years, and every single year the wineries did this. And eventually what we found was that no more than 5% of the wines were being identified as light. 50% were still medium, and the rest were heavy. It was the style that was being made in those days in order to capture points, not to address the question of what wine competition judges would see. This was obviously not a great system, so we eventually abandoned it because it had done for us what we wanted it to do. And we began to institute, sometime about 1999, a new policy for blended red wine. And that was, light, medium, and heavy. We had a lot of blended reds. We had a lot of Rhone-style blends, and some of them were light, and they were being slaughtered. So we decided to give them their own category. Once we did that, we found that the scores improved. The light wines were judged only against light wines. There was no order error, the way Amarine and Ressler talked about in their 1976 book on sensory evaluation. So we didn't have the problem of order error. We did have the problem of central tendency, which if you read that book, you'll know is a huge problem, but that was something we dealt with in the following year. When the light, medium, and heavy red wine blends category came in, what we found, and here's the real story, which nobody told, even me, because there was no scientific proof, was that the wines that got the most gold medals in the blended categories all had some Petit Sirah in it. Why? It's pretty evident to me. The blend wouldn't have been as good without it. So the end result was that I began to tinker more and more with the competitions to try, both Long Beach and Riverside, to try to get them to address these questions in a way that was benefit to, at Rusty's point, the consumer. How do we get this message to the consumer? Well, it's really not very easy because I don't have oodles of time